Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, a centuries-long tradition of fascination with Tibet and Tibetan culture. Less so Tibetan people, but more like our ideas and our crafts and our arts, and like, our magic. So there's, for centuries, literally, Westerners, Europeans, even Chinese, Japanese monks, like people all around the world have written about Tibet. And Tibetans have our own literary canon of, a robust literary canon, and then an even more robust oral storytelling canon. But I think there's been a way in which other people have gotten very comfortable speaking about Tibet. And a lot of those narratives, unfortunately, have a certain like recurring dynamics in which like Tibetan people are just sort of like, I guess, props or like background. And often they're sidekicks for like the sort of the spiritual liberation of the Western hero. And that's a narrative trope we see over and over again, including in Lost Horizon, which I mentioned in this novel, which was the quote unquote first paperback novel published in the world. And that takes place in a mythical kingdom of Shangri-La in Tibet, in which the Western heroes, sort of converse with the Chinese leader of this town. And the Tibetans who are from there are sort of mute kind of animals who like basically labor, but they don't benefit from the kingdom. They don't benefit from the ability to live forever, which everybody else can in Shangri-La, so the Westerners and the Chinese leader. So again, these are like colonial fantasies, and they're fantasies that are like allowed to carry on if nobody pushes against them. And it's really important that Tibetan people's stories, we've been telling stories for as long as we could have. And even during the height of the refugee sort of exodus from Tibet in the 60s, I look at videos on YouTube and I recognize some of these people, and they were telling stories back then, but nobody was listening. So, I think it's really, there's so much about how ready the world is to receive Tibetan stories. And then that does threaten sort of fantasies about Tibet. I grew up around a lot of Tibetan women, in kitchens, going to the market, and gossiping, telling stories. I just grew up in that environment of Tibetan women and the ways in which they quietly and sometimes not so quietly like hold our community together and shape like our consciousnesses as children and stuff like that. So I wanted to talk about Tibetan women because that was like the raw material of my life. When I look around, I saw a lot of Tibetan women. But how I create a character is a very difficult question, I think, for any writer to answer, because in some ways I feel like those characters have always existed and I just didn't know how to listen to them. And I think a lot of my writing is almost like auditory, like I'm like trying to hear them and I'm trying to listen for false notes when I don't do the right thing for the character. And as I'm writing it, I truly feel like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know who these people are. I don't know where they're coming from. They're not real people, but they're also not completely invented. I don't know where they come from. It's very opaque to me as well. Yeah, that's an interesting one because I was always a reader, and I grew up in Nepal, and my father was a big reader. And he would take me to the bookstore in Nepal because there weren't really any public libraries there. And he would take me to the bookstore once or twice a month. And that was always a really big thing because I would get to pick one book. And that was a significant expense in Nepal. So I always worshipped books. I always worshipped storytelling. But I didn't think of it myself as becoming a writer because I didn't know how to do that or what was possible. But I remember one time I had painted some painting and my father like immediately, it was not a good painting, but he immediately framed it and put it in the living room next to like actual artworks. And then I had written a poem, and I think I was like 8, and it was about impermanence. And I didn't think it was anything special, but he was convinced that it was really special. And he sent it off to the newspaper, the main newspaper in Kathmandu at the time. And I saw it there like a few days later. And I was like, holy smokes, that's a thing that you can do. Like, you can have your work published. And I was really just taken aback. And I think that just shows like how important it was that I had somebody who was like such a dreamer and like didn't really think of these things as being impossible. And I remember at the time I was writing a diary. I was still learning English, and I had bought myself my first diary, and I was writing it, and I based one of my first short stories I was published at the Malahat Review was written in sort of the language that I had, the English that I had at the time, which was quite, I guess, broken English, you would call it. But in that diary, I wrote that I wanted to be a writer. And I forgot all about that. And I remembered it only years later when I was taking an elective creative writing course at UBC. I was actually there to do a philosophy and international relations double major, and I was in those programs. And I just decided to take a creative writing course. And I was writing this short story for them, that eventually went in the Malahat Review with broken English. And I was looking through my diary and I saw that. And so I think that somewhere in the back of my head, it was always there, but I forgot about it for years. I guess kind of like a terma. Yeah. But like there was this desire in my head, and I buried it, I guess, or it just, became more practical. Not that philosophy is terribly practical, but so yeah. And then I wrote that short story, and my teacher encouraged me, Barbara Parkin, whom I'll always be thankful to. She encouraged me to apply for the major, and I did. And I got in and just never stopped after that.